You have talked about a new generation of leadership, and if you became president, you would be the youngest president in history. And yet you don't have a majority of young voters in this country, according to polls. Is there a way in which you're out of touch with your own generation?
No, but it is certainly the case that often
Then
younger candidates tend to attract more support from older voters. But we are building a coalition that's going to draw voters from every part of this country. Now, certainly
you're at 3 and 4% among people under the age of 44 in South Carolina. It's almost as bad as minority voters. What explains that gap?
Look, there's going to be a continued process to earn support across the coalition. But it's certainly the case that many of the younger voters are more attracted to, for example, the Sanders campaign definitely has more young voters. I was a big fan of Bernie Sanders when I was 18 years old. It's also the case that we are pulling together a coalition to talk about issues like climate, to act on issues like climate and guns and the economy, that the longer you're planning to be here, the more you have at stake. And young voters have to mobilize in a way that hasn't happened before if we're going to be able to defeat this president.
So what you heard there was Pete Buttigieg on the defensive. He was being asked about how, even though he would be the youngest president ever if he wins the nomination and wins the general election, he doesn't have a whole lot of support amongst young people, with a lot of those people going to Bernie Sanders. And he gives a whole bunch of reasons for this, but there's one particular moment in this interview that shows Pete Buttigieg's condescension and rejection of the concerns young people have. And it was that line where he said, when I was 18 years old, I was a big supporter of Bernie Sanders too. Basically implying that 18-year-olds, that young people more broadly defined, are in a sort of experimental, transitional, optimistic, Pollyannic phase where they just want to vote for the most radical ideology, but eventually they'll snap out of it and they'll become more pragmatic and more realistic. That's what Pete Buttigieg is trying to say. That young people, that millennials and Gen Z people that are still with Bernie Sanders are first and foremost unrealistic. And that when they grow up, they'll learn to support a pragmatic progressive, quote unquote, like Pete Buttigieg. And I just want to say that this is the very sort of thing I was talking about a couple days ago, where I made a video exploring why young people like Bernie and they don't seem to like Buttigieg. Not only does Bernie, in a lot of the polling we've seen, have a majority of young voters support, not just a plurality, but a majority, more than everyone else combined. Pete Buttigieg often lags behind Warren and Biden, and in some polls, he's behind Gabbard and Yang when it comes to young people, showing that he's not even remotely competitive amongst voters under 35, let alone 18-year-olds. And I said the reason that is because Pete Buttigieg is inauthentic. Pete Buttigieg doesn't have any real, core beliefs that he sticks by, with the exception of his love of billionaire donors and letting billionaires help shape his platform. Other than that, Pete Buttigieg has no values. And Pete Buttigieg has not really shown, in my view, a systemic desire to reach out to young people and to champion their concerns. To say, I am the candidate of the millennial and Gen Z generations, and as such, I am going to stand with the things they stand for, fight for the things they need, fight against the things that give them concern and fear, and help build a movement based on the leadership of my generation. Not just me as a figurehead for young people, but to build a broad-based youth movement. And he has not done that. And the only candidate to really center young people and the desires of young people and the concerns of young people is the oldest goddamn man in the race, Bernie Sanders. He's the only one on policy like free education, on Medicare for all, on fighting for good jobs, on fighting for a Green New Deal, on fighting for greater economic equality and opportunity for everyone. He's the only one on every issue that is actually pushing for the progress young people want to see and the specific needs of young people. Young people aren't with Bernie Sanders because they're misled, young radicals who just need to smarten up. Young people are with Bernie Sanders because Bernie Sanders is with them. And young people are with Bernie Sanders because young people in general are more progressive than older people. They want more bold left-wing policy. They want to transform America to make it a more just, humane, and dignified society for all. And they do not see that in Pete Buttigieg. It doesn't matter that Pete Buttigieg is a relatively young man. It doesn't matter that, yes, he would be the youngest president ever. It doesn't matter that it is good to see younger people on the debate stage. It's important to see that. But that doesn't matter if that particular person doesn't stand with you. And it doesn't matter if Pete Buttigieg is basically a generational sellout and he's trying to sell the prospect of a millennial president to predominantly boomer and older audiences. That's not how this is going to work. Pete Buttigieg needs to realize that the reason he's struggling with groups like young people is entirely his fault. It's his fault that young people want better and he's not giving it. It's his fault that young people don't want half measures and all he's offering is half measures at best. It's his fault that there's a clear example of the sort of youth-driven politics that he could represent being offered by Bernie Sanders, and he chooses to reject that. So this is a very important clip. It shows a couple things. It shows, one, that when Pete Buttigieg is on the defensive, he gets this really sort of ugly air to himself. Pete Buttigieg is so polished, and when he speaks on his own terms, he comes off as optimistic and quite effective from an objective standpoint. Like, I'm not saying I support the guy, but you can see why he has the potential to be an effective politician at the highest levels, given the level of polish he has. But when you get him on these sorts of moments and you actually start to question him, he really adorns this sort of aggressive, attacking air that I don't think is becoming. And two, it really shows he can't understand why young people don't want to back him. So the only thing he can say is, young people are stupid, they'll figure it out eventually. Well, Pete, we've figured it out. We love Bernie Sanders. We don't like you. And that's going to be the reality, that you will not win without increasing your support from young people. And you won't increase your support from young people. That's the end of the story. But there was a key point here at the end that I just want to finish up on. Pete Buttigieg did make a good point here. He said at the end that young people are going to have to mobilize like never before if we want to defeat Donald Trump. And Pete, you're right. But first, we have to mobilize behind Bernie Sanders to defeat neoliberal hacks like you, and then continue to mobilize behind Bernie Sanders to defeat Donald Trump and make him the first president, and I don't know how long, that actually gives a damn about young people. If you become the president, you won't give a damn about us.